One gigantic thank you to Ben Bishop for preaching last week for me. If you haven't had a chance to listen to his message, it was fantastic. It's on the website, it's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, so be sure to check that out. You will be blessed. And so wherever you are, Ben, thank you so much for preaching for me. It was just outside of Phoenix, Arizona, where I received my vision of my future. I was walking up a staircase to a water slide at a resort that my friend's family invited me to kind of tag along with because they had an extra spot. I was a junior in high school, and so my self-esteem was at an all-time high. So I, a real embodiment of David Hasselhoff, made my way up this staircase with a swag that let everybody know that I was the real deal. Well, as I made it to the top of the staircase, I looked, and there before me was a good-looking lifeguard waving kids through. And I thought for sure I had a chance of sparking a real connection. But being that I was significantly younger and ignored, and I looked a little bit more like Steve Urkel, I stood no chance. But then I thought, hey, if I was a lifeguard, I would have an opportunity to have these innocent conversations, these small talks with girls, and then get a good tan in the process. And then it hit me. I'm called to be a lifeguard. And so that's what I did. I went back home to Oregon, and I went through all the training and certification to become a lifeguard, and I landed my first lifeguard job. But it wasn't at a luxurious resort. It was at my high school. Nothing like my experience in Arizona. In Arizona, you have the heat from the sun that you can bathe in with the side of palm trees kind of lining the resort. In my high school, you had the sticky air filled with sweat and chlorine, with screams that just kind of bounced off the peeling gray walls. And contrary to my expectation, it was often overcrowded with mindless and rebellious preteens. This was not the lifeguard experience that I had signed up for. In my mind, I had this image of what a lifeguard was going to be like, and then there was the reality. And these two couldn't be any different. Now, the most obvious difference was the location. A lifeguard job in Arizona is very different from a lifeguard job in Oregon. One was at a resort, and the other one was in the throes of a deteriorating pool room in my high school. In my dreams, it was low pressure and with plenty of opportunities to meet people my age, but in reality, it was this crisis management situation of keeping little kids off of the net. To make matters worse, I had constantly had to be on alert to make sure nobody was drowning when I was on the clock. To make sure that we're all on the same page, that vision of being a lifeguardian, it was short-lived. And I found the girl of my dreams not at a pool, but at Bible college. And this week, Wednesday, we celebrated 9 years of marriage. But when I think about my brief encounter of being a lifeguard and what that actually entailed for my life, there's many parallels to life, right? Many of us, we start out pursuing something, and then we get into it only to realize it wasn't what we expected. We get married, and we have this idea of what marriage is supposed to be like, and then we realize that we were either basing that off of this ideal we had, or maybe our parents' marriage. We go to school and we get all of this training certification to get into a certain career, a certain field, and then we get into that and we realize that it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. We get to the end of our careers, we prepare for retirement, and then we get there and things in retirement suddenly look different than what we thought they were going to be like. We're busier than ever. We feel a need to reinvent ourselves to do something else. They weren't what we expected. And on we can just add to this list. But one of the things that I find relevant when we talk about reality and the dreams is how it pertains to the Christian faith and the church. So many people that come to faith in Jesus genuinely believing that by doing that, life all of a sudden is going to become easier and more blissful. But what they find out is that while becoming a Christian is simple, it is not easy. Nor do your struggles just disappear. They stay. And then when you think about the church, you come to a passage like Acts chapter 2, where you read these radical things that the church did, and you come and you expect to experience the same sort of encounter as Acts 2, where they're selling their property, they're giving to the poor, and they're doing all these things. And you show up to church and you're like, well, this isn't kind of what I see in Acts 2. And you're a little disappointed. Because the church today is about as flawed as the people who come and gather in it. And we have an image in our mind, and then there's the reality. And as Christians, where are we supposed to be? Are we supposed to live in that ideal world of what we think things are supposed to be? Or are we just supposed to accept things as they are? Right? One seems really optimistic, and the other one very pessimistic. But what do we do? I mean, what should you do? When the picture of Christianity is different than you expected, what do you do? When the picture of the church is different than the ideals that you see in the New Testament, what do you do? Here's what a lot of people do. They give up on their reality and they search for something that suits their dreams. And maybe Jesus isn't doing what you thought he should do. And so you think maybe no faith is the option, or maybe another faith is the route I should go. And maybe the church is not as welcoming as you thought, or as deep as you thought, or as service-oriented as you expected. And so maybe you think, maybe I should go somewhere else that fits my dreams of the church. What should you be doing when your dreams look different than the real world? Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, if you want to open up, that's where we're going to be. Paul, very interestingly, he has an encounter with the Corinthians because to them, Paul is not living up to their expectations, their ideals of who an apostle is to be. And it's why Paul opens this chapter with a series of questions. And so if you have your Bibles, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 1. Paul says this. He says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord?" Apparently their answer is no, right? Their response to Paul is, no, Paul, you're not an apostle. At least you're not the kind of apostle we expected you to be. And if you go back to the previous chapter, in chapter 8, Paul addresses an issue about Christians eating meat that has been sacrificed in a pagan temple. And some of the Christians, they thought it was perfectly fine because we're not actually worshiping these other so-called gods. And they tell Paul, set these weaker Christians straight. Correct their false theology. And Paul tells those who are stronger, actually, I want you to limit your freedom. Rather than telling these weaker Christians just to kind of grow up. Paul tells these stronger Christians, limit your freedom. And they would have thought, hey, if Paul really had the authority of an apostle, you would expect him to throw his authority around a little bit more in this situation. You would expect Paul to come in as a boss and just tell people how to act. Because he's not doing that, it's causing us to doubt whether or not he even has the authority to say such. Maybe he's not an apostle. And to translate that over for today, they had a dream of what an apostle would be, but that was different than the reality. And so Paul states up front what he's planning to do in this chapter. Here's what he says in verse 3. This is the point that he has for this chapter in 1 Corinthians. He says this, "This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me." Paul says that because his image as an apostle has fallen on hard times, he plans on bringing a case to them just as you would at a court of law. The reason this is important is not because Paul's concerned about his self-image. Paul's concerned that them downplaying his role as an apostle would actually be them downplaying God's word spoken through him. But why did Paul's image as an apostle come under such harsh criticism? There's a variety of reasons for this, but the key issue Paul brings out in chapter 9 is that he refuses, get this, to accept a paycheck from them. He refuses to accept financial support from the Christians in Corinth. And they go, well, maybe he's not an apostle. Which seems really strange, doesn't it? I mean, if somebody came up to me and offered me a few bucks to go get lunch after service, and I said, no, thank you, I doubt any one of you would walk away going, well, maybe he's not a pastor. Like, we would never think this, but that's what's happening to Paul. Very strange. In fact, in Paul's defense, he gives three metaphors. A metaphor of a soldier, a gardener, and a farmer, all of which communicate that they have the right to receive support and nourishment from their own livelihood, from their own occupation. And his point is this: if as an apostle, preaching the gospel, going around starting churches all over the world, he has the right to receive support from them for what he's doing. And this they would have agreed with. They would have said, yes, we understand that, Paul. Why are you refusing to receive our financial support? Paul, as a legitimate apostle, he has the right to receive support from them. In fact, he could even demand support from them. But here's what he says in verse 12. He says, if others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Paul does not accept their support because he sees this as somehow hindering the advancement of the gospel in the city of Corinth. Now, there's two really important things to understand about what Paul is saying and doing here. The first, and this is the key point Paul is making to them in this passage, is the fact that there was biblical and social precedent for him to receive support from them, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He doesn't make that right as an apostle. In fact, 6 times in our passage, Paul talks about his right or his authority that he has an apostle. And the contrast is that the Christians that he is writing to in Corinth, they are making free use of their right and the authority to get whatever they wanted. Whereas Paul, a legitimate apostle, he's going, this is my right, and I refuse to accept it. Doing the exact opposite of what is happening in Corinth. Because he sees this as holding the gospel back. But this raises another issue. In the ancient world, they did not have what we would consider to be salaried positions within the church. In the church, the pastor did not have this sort of set annual salary where he would receive a certain amount with health benefits and a tax break and a tax return at the end of the fiscal year. There was no doubt people in the church who supported those who gave their lives to full-time ministry in the church. But for someone like Paul moved around constantly. He was never in one place long enough. He was what you would call a traveling preacher. And so as a public speaker who would travel around, you had one of 4 ways to actually get money to be able to live. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to maintain a career being a traveling communicator. And here's what he could have done. He could have charged people a fee for coming to church to hear a message. Like, hey, pay up, right? One of the other things he could have done is he could have found a sponsor to sponsor him financially as he did what he did. He could have begged on the streets, hey, I'm really poor, I got a great message, give me some money. Or he could have done what he did. Got a trade job and began to work to supply income so he could do ministry. In the church of Corinth, it appears from the letter to them that Paul runs most often into conflict, into issues with those who were wealthier in Corinth, who were well-to-do, who had a great social standing, even a greater privileged standing than Paul himself. Them to accept Paul's authority as their apostle, it seemed demeaning to them. And so they struggled to accept Paul's authority. To them, if you're going to have authority as a leader in the church, you better be a polished speaker. You better be able to work a room. You better be able to be a boss and show up and tell people what to do. You better work not a low-income job, but be able to associate with those who are at least at your social standing. Paul did not fit the bill. Paul did not fit their expectation and job description as an apostle, and so his authority was under question. And so the first defense that Paul gives is to show that as an apostle of Jesus, he has the right to receive support from them. And here's his best defense in verse 14, and this comes right from Jesus. He says, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. And everyone would agree with Paul on this. But why does he not receive support? This is something they wouldn't understand. Paul, you are entitled to this, so why do you reject it? And the answer to this is the second part of his defense, and he sums it up like this in verse 18. He says, what then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. God did not charge Paul a fee before he heard the message of the gospel, and therefore he is not going to charge anybody else a fee for hearing the gospel. Salvation was freely offered by Jesus, therefore salvation is freely presented to all. He doesn't want anyone to get the impression that he is in this for financial support. We don't know the exact situation in Corinth because Paul doesn't exactly tell us what's going on. But given the fact that Paul does receive support from other churches, like the church in Philippi, they support Paul financially. But given the fact that Paul is rejecting their support, but he freely receives support from other churches, we get the indication that maybe the church in Corinth would charge people when they came in. I don't know this, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but maybe they would charge people as they came in and say, hey, by the way, this is Paul's requirement. We're giving this money to Paul. I don't know. But for Paul, the reward is not the finances. For Paul, it's seeing people respond to the gospel message. That's the reward. That's the benefit. Now, Paul is not just defending himself as an apostle. He's also giving them a model for how they should be living. In a sense, Paul is saying, hey, you have an idea of who I'm supposed to be, so let me go ahead and clarify things a little bit. This is who I am in the real world. This is real life Paul. Paul says, my goal is not simply for my benefit, it is actually to teach you a little bit about how to live in this world. So what does Paul teach them? He's teaching them that they are to revoke their own rights on how they should be living. They should revoke their own rights. Now, Paul's message is in essence this. When you really understand who Jesus is and what the gospel is, then you will not elevate yourself. You will not elevate your rights. You will not elevate anything above another person. Rather, you will do what Paul does and you will relinquish your rights for the benefit of other people. And for the Christians in Corinth, they are doing the exact opposite, right? They see Jesus setting them free as a license to do whatever they have the right and the freedom to do. And Paul says, not only is that wrong, but that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel itself. When you really get who Jesus is, when you really understand what He is about and what Jesus did on the cross for you, it leads people toward this mindset that values others ahead of themselves, that values other people as greater than yourselves in every possible way. And Paul says in Philippians 2 that we are to regard other people in the same way Christ regarded us. Right? He sacrificed His life for us, opening the door of salvation for us and giving us an example for how we treat other people. And Paul says the same thing here. And in Galatians 5, it says, Paul sums it up like this. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Corinth, they understood this. We're free. Paul says, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Corinth was pros at that right there. He says, rather serve one another humbly in love. This is Paul's correction. And so Paul goes on in verses 19 through 23 to talk about how he lives this out and why they should do this. He says to those who are culturally and ethnically, they're Jewish. Paul says, look, I adapt the way I live to look like them. He goes to synagogue. He participates in the Jewish festivals. He avoids things that would be extremely offensive to other Jewish people. And he chooses to respect their laws and their customs. In other words, Paul, when he's around Jews, he lives like a good Jew. And to those who are not culturally and ethnically Jewish, and therefore they're not aware of the Jewish customs and laws, Paul doesn't live like a good Jew. He lives like a good Roman. And Paul says, in other words, Christ set us free, not so that we would be relatable to one group of people, but so that we can be relatable to any group of people that we are around. Christ sets us free from our need to fit into a certain mold, to a certain group of people, by God accepting us to Himself. Jesus accepts us in, and therefore we do not need to feel constrained to look to anyone else or anything else to find approval of ourselves. God says, by my Son Jesus, who died for you, by the way, and He was raised from the dead, you have God's stamp of approval on your life. God has accepted you in Christ. And therefore, we're set free from this need to conform to others, to find their approval. We're set free. And now we can adapt how we live. Not for a sense of approval, but so that the gospel of Jesus Christ can be relatable to any group of people. And here's my favorite verse in the whole Bible. This is my life verse, if you will. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 22. He explains why he adapts his life. This is what he says. He says, to the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings. Paul says he becomes all things to all people. So when he comes to tell people about Jesus, they look at him and they go, Paul is one of our own. He's like us. He's our own kind of people. He's not a foreigner telling them how it ought to be done. He's one of us. And in my mind, here is the most challenging thing for us, for Jesus followers, for Christians. Do your non-Jesus following friends, do your non-Christian friends, family members, co-workers see you as one of their own? Do they see you as somebody that they can relate to? I think if we're honest, most Christians have been more focused on making sure that we look nothing like the world, that those who are in the world do not see us as relatable people who have anything relevant to say. And similarly, we have valued a separation from the world, that we feel the most at home with those who look and act the most like us. And as this mindset works its way through churches all over the Western world, it creates this expectation that those who are really the spiritual elites among us are those who are the most involved in all of the church activities that are going around. And what begins to happen is this slow separation begins to take place from Christians in the world. And as a result, very few Christians know any non-Christians or any people who who don't have any faith or who have a different faith. And if we do know those people, even fewer would see those as meaningful friendships or meaningful relationships. The current statistic says that when the average person becomes a believer in Jesus, it just takes within 2 short years for them to lose almost all contact with non-Christians. That is not what Paul was about. And Paul was not saying that, he adapted his message so that his message would be relatable to all people. Far, far from that. Paul's message of the gospel of Jesus, who Jesus is, what Jesus did, that never changed. That was timeless. That was a universal truth. Paul's message never changed, but he adapted how he lived constantly. Paul adapted his method, but not his message. And similarly, Paul would tell them in Corinth the same thing, and he tells us the same thing. Here's Paul's strategy for us and for them. Adapt the method, not the message. Adapt the method, not the message. Why do that? It's simply that more and more people would relate to us as we relay the message of Jesus to others. If we remain unrelatable to others, God's message will remain irrelevant to others. Now, 4 times in 4 verses, Paul says something to the effect of, I do this to win them to Christ. To the weak I become weak to win the weak to Christ. I do all of this to win as many people as possible. This is Paul's method. He adapts his life to those that he's around so that he can earn the respect and the friendships of others, so that the unchanging message about Jesus would be relevant to those who would give him a listening ear to hear. And so here's the key idea for us this morning. If you're taking notes, here it is. Relate to others to relay the message. Relate to others to relay the message. But to do that, it requires 3 important things that Paul brings out in this passage. The first thing is this, that we need to make a commitment to making the gospel known. Commit to making the gospel known. Paul seems to believe that if you value anything else as more important than getting the gospel out, then you will see adapting how you live as a big threat to your life, to your church, to wherever you're at. When we served in youth ministry back in California, we would have parents who were concerned that by letting their kid come to our youth group, that they would be around people who would be a negative influence on their life. In fact, over half of the kids who came to our youth group, they didn't have Christian parents, and they did not have any sort of faith in Jesus, nor did they live a very wise life, if you understand what I mean by that. And so when a concerned parent would approach me or one of our leaders, they were concerned that our youth group would have a negative influence on their child. And here was our response to the parents. Our commitment is to making the gospel known to non-Christians and those who were on the fringes. It was not to Christians. Look, if your son, if your daughter's a Christian, look, that's fantastic. We are genuinely really excited they have a relationship with Jesus. But please know that youth group is not for them. Youth group is not for them to come and to be served. Youth group is for them to come and serve. A youth group is for them to come and not to expect to receive these new teachings or anything like that. Youth group is their opportunity to minister to do ministry to those non-Christians who happen to show up that night. That's the role of the Christians coming to youth group. And to those who are not committed to making the gospel known as the most important priority by whatever means necessary, that was a very threatening thing to say. But that was our commitment as a youth group. That was our commitment as a youth team. That was our commitment as a church. And that's the commitment Paul asks every single one of us to make. You got to make the gospel, making it known, getting it out, the most important thing to live for. And if we really want the gospel to become relevant to others, we have to make a commitment to making it known in a relatable way to those who do not believe in Jesus. And so if you're not around any non-Christians, if you're not around people who have a different faith belief than you may just consider picking up a new hobby where you can rub shoulders with somebody who's not a Christian. It may mean rekindling some old friendships that have been lost due to time and separation. Here's the second commitment. Make a commitment to disciplined selflessness. Commit to disciplined selflessness. In verses 24 through 27, and we won't read it right now, but Paul gives this analogy of an athletic game and competing in it. It takes this rugged commitment to compete in a game like the Olympics. Nobody simply just gets into the Olympics, because they sit on the couch and they eat potato chips, or in that case, Chick-fil-A waffle fries, because they're excellent. You don't get into the Olympics just because you do that. It is only those who have the greatest amount of physical and mental discipline over the years with an extreme amount of determination where they get to a point where they can compete in the games like the Olympics. And similarly, we ought to have the same sort of rugged commitment to making sure that we do not let ourselves get in the way of winning souls. We have to take the back seat. And if we become so concerned about a certain issue, whereby that be political, racial, or even relational, where we lose sight, where we cannot look past something that is in our past, and we fail to reach out to our world, we have got to be able to be at a place where we can look past things from in other people's lives, that we can reach out to the world. The only thing that should matter the most to us, it's not, who gets voted in, it's not how somebody gets voted in, but it is whether or not we have the ability with integrity and good faith to build relationship with those that may disagree with us. The gospel proclamation is the most important thing in all of life. And to do that, it requires a careful discipline to keep ourselves in check, to keep what is of primary importance to be primary importance, to keep the things that are secondary, secondary. And to do that, the only way to do it is through a commitment to being selfless, to taking the second chair. We put the needs of others, the benefit of others, ahead of ourselves. Here's the third commitment we need to make. We need to make a commitment to building others up in love. Building others up in love. Being relatable does not mean, hear me clearly, it does not mean we absorb everybody else's belief. Okay, that's not what this means. It doesn't even mean you have to agree with everybody, right? But it does mean we make a commitment to loving people and building them up. And look, it's really hard. It's really hard to stay mad at somebody who is constantly loving you, constantly serving you, constantly praying for you. Even somebody who disagrees with you. It's really hard for them to not see their own selves as being valued and appreciate that. And so going back to my lifeguard job, it was not what I imagined it to be. I was not in the Phoenix area at a beautiful resort. I was in a sweaty, smelly room with a bunch of screaming kids who had a rugged commitment to pushing my buttons. That was what they were committed to when they showed up to the pool. Let's make Skylar the lifeguard mad. And so I had a choice. I could go, you know what, this is not the lifeguard job that I imagined it to be. Or I could adapt to being a lifeguard to where I actually was. And for the Christians in Corinth, Paul did not fit their mold. And for Paul, that was a very intentional thing on his part. He was trying to teach them that what is the most important thing is not where you are, but what you are doing with where you are. Being a Christian means we are, on the one hand, we belong to only one kingdom, and we belong to no other kingdom. The kingdom of heaven. And by belonging to that one kingdom, it frees us up to then being able to live literally in every kingdom. The kingdom of heaven liberates us so that we can actually, truly, and for the first time, actually be alive in the world and belong in the world. And what happens when we encounter a Christian faith that is not what we expect, or a church that does not live up to our dreams, is that rather than adapt, many people get angry, they get disappointed, that the world, whatever world that may be, doesn't measure up to the expectations they had, like Paul. I love this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He put it like this. This is in his book, Life Together. He says, those who love their dream of a Christian community more than they love the Christian community itself become destroyers of that Christian community. Even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial. God hates this wishful dreaming because it makes the dreamer proud and pretentious. Those who dream of this idolized community demand that it be fulfilled by God, by others, and by themselves. They enter the community of Christians with their demands set up by their own law, and they judge one another and God accordingly. It is not we who build. Christ builds the church. What a powerful, powerful word. It's possible to fall more in love with your dreams, whatever that may be, more than where you are. It's possible to love the idea of something more than the actual thing. It's possible to love the dreams of where you would like God to have you spiritually or wherever more than where God has you right now. And so as I was sitting in my lifeguard chair, I had the moment of a lifetime. It came to me. A kid who was about 10 feet from the wall of the pool, he began to kind of dog paddle, and then he dipped under the water. And this was a common occurrence, as not that I was a bad lifeguard, but it was a common occurrence for the terrorists who showed up to my pool on a weekly basis. So I expected this to happen, but he came up out of the water, and I heard over all of this noise a faint cry for help. And I leaped off my chair, I hopped in the water, I pushed my lifeguard flotation device thingy, whatever they call that thing, over to him, and I pulled him over to the wall. I tell you, I have never experienced the kind of adrenaline rush that I experienced that moment. Nor have I ever witnessed somebody who was actually on the verge of drowning, and I felt the pressure for the first time in my life that this boy's life was in my hands. That was overwhelming. And what a real tragedy would it have been if I was more focused on the lifeguard job I wish I had, that I missed the lifeguard duties that I actually had. That boy may not have lived that day if I was daydreaming, if I was caught up in my dreams instead of the world that I was actually in. What if I was more focused on the dream than adapting to the place that God had me? And same to you. What if we get so caught up? What if you get so caught up in the dream of what you wish that you miss, of where you are actually at and what God actually wants you to do? What if you get so caught up thinking, man, I wish I had this kind of group of friends, or I wish I had this, that you miss who God has actually placed in your life and you fail to adapt to be a relatable person? Church, may we not fall asleep that we miss to hear the importance of Paul's message to us today. Because something far more important, something far more lasting, something far more life-saving depends on whether or not we adapt ourselves to the world that God has actually placed us into. Let us make a commitment to relate to others, to relay the message. I'd like to invite the team